Good afternoon and welcome to Matters Financial and Geopolitical from a Frontier. I apologise for my absence, but on Monday of this week I felt rather unwell and my daughter Layla absolutely insisted on taking me to the hospital, and I'll tell you a little bit about that. And I just got back, so I thought, let me have a look at what's happening and catch up with the podcast. Sitting in a hospital for 5 days with those beeping going on, and you really do tend to think about your personal life and what does it mean and what matters to you. And I remember that Don DeLillo quote that we are the last billionth of a second in the evolution of matter. And I certainly felt that. Leaving the hospital today, having had an opportunity in between the white noise, everything seems white and flashing, and the beeps and the nebulizer to reflect on my life, for which I'm tremendously grateful, especially to find myself here as well. Other home thoughts, I read some Haruki Murakami, The Underground Worlds. In his fiction, he has written about phantom sheep, about spirits meeting up in a nether world, about little people who emerge from a painting. But beneath the evocative, often dreamlike imagery, his work is most often a study of missed connections, of both the comedy and the tragedy, triggered by our failures to understand one another. And indeed, thoroughly enjoyed that, and that from there, his talk says, I look around the world and I describe what I see, and then I come back. Coming back is important. If you cannot come back, it's scary, but I'm a professional, so I can come back. And in this article, you said once that your life's dream was to sit at the bottom of a well. You've had a number of characters do exactly that. I would become terribly claustrophobic, like I did when they put me in that capsule for the MRI, and I couldn't do it. There's a character in Killing Commendatore, Menshiki, who does it. Why? I like wells very much. I like refrigerators. I like elephants. There are many things that I like. When I write about the things I like, I'm happy. When I was a kid, there was a well at my house, and I always looked into that well, and my imagination grew. There's a short story by Raymond Carver about falling into a dry well. I love that story very much. And that took me to Khalil Gibran on joy and sorrow. Your joy is your sorrow unmasked. And the self-same well from which your laughter rises was oftentimes filled with your tears. How else can it be? The deeper that sorrow carves into your being, the more joy you can contain. Is not the cup that holds your wine the very cup that was burned in the potter's oven? And is not the lute that soothes your spirit the very wood that was hollowed with knives? When you are joyous, look deep into your heart, and you shall find it is only that which has given you sorrow that is giving you joy. Some of you say joy is greater than sorrow, and others say no, sorrow is the greater. But I say unto you, they are inseparable. Together they come, and when one sits alone with you at your board, remember that the other is asleep on your bed. Verily, you are suspended like scales between your sorrow and your joy. Only when you are empty are you at standstill and balanced. When the treasure keeper lifts you to weigh his gold and his silver, needs must your joy or your sorrow rise or fall. And on that note, I went to something else I came across, Tatiana Shield. It's not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood. Very interesting article I came across in the Paris Review, The Clarity of Violence, on rereading Don DeLillo's White Noise. Really is very, very good. Gladney experiences a moment of splendid transcendence, hearing his sleeping daughter mutter over and over the brand name of an automobile. In the world of DeLillo's novels, what lies beneath or beyond is too terrifying to contemplate, and so his characters are trapped in a surface world, dense with colour and sound and signifiers, that if unravelled point to nowhere more profound than a supermarket aisle or the make of a car. And then listen to this. Sitting on the floor of my parents' living room, I came across a passage in White Noise I remembered vividly. It is the scene near the end of the novel in which Jack Gladney points a gun at the man who has been sleeping with his wife and pulls the trigger. Gladney watches as his victim's blood flows from his body. I knew then what red was, saw it in terms on dominant wavelength, luminance, purity. Such a brilliant writer. I love Don DeLillo. Macro thoughts. Well, that was finally the move that I'd written about week in, week out happened. On the 19th of August, I said, safe havens are priced for Armageddon now. 1st of April, I said there is certainly a fin de siècle, even apocalyptic mood afoot. Then I said the conundrum for those who wish to bet on the end of the world is this. However, what would be the point? The world would have ended. The massive haven rout yesterday sent a wall of money rushing into emerging markets. The yield on Argentina's 100-year bond fell for a third day to below 17%. Nigeria's 2047 debt shaved off 15 basis points of yield. Angola shed 13 basis points, building on a 23-point drop on Wednesday. So finally we saw investors search and hunt for yield. Let's see how long that will last for. And you saw a big sell-off. This is from Patrick Rooney. Not too often we see bonds get taken for 2 points. 10-year yield is now up the most since December 2015. That's from Lisa Abramovitz. And I've spoken about this before when I wrote about the Wizard of Oz world. And I said the wizard appears in a different form, once as a giant head, a beautiful fairy, a ball of fire, and as a horrible monster. When at last he grants an audience to all of them at once, he seems to be a disembodied voice. Eventually it is revealed that Oz is actually none of these things, but rather an ordinary conman from Omaha, Nebraska, who has been using elaborate magic tricks and props to make himself seem great and powerful. And there's the moment in The Wizard of Oz when the curtain is opened and there you see him as for what he really is. And I think yesterday you had that moment happen in the markets. That's why you had the biggest bond rout in years. Yields on 2-year notes jumped as much as 14 basis points, largest full-day increase in a decade, before pulling back to 11 points. 30-year German rates briefly turned positive after a month under zero. Treasury yields hit their highs of their day after growth at US service businesses beat estimates. Deluge of investment-grade corporate bonds sold by Apple, Walt Disney flooded the market with supply, and this tends to drive up yields. Rate on the 30-year Treasury sank to a record low of 190 just on August 28. Most investors expect the ECB and Federal Reserve to add more accommodation this month. That's without a doubt. Rate futures traders are pricing in another quarter-point reduction at this next meeting in the US and a total of about 60 basis points by year end. 24th of June, I said, we are in nosebleed territory, this is voodoo economics, and that when the curtain was lifted in The Wizard of Oz and the wizard revealed to be an ordinary conman from Omaha who has been using elaborate tricks and props to make himself seem great and powerful. And indeed, that's what we saw happen. Political reflections. Robert Mugabe, the former leader of Zimbabwe, has died at the age of 95. He said on his 88th birthday, "I've died many times. That's where I've beaten Christ. Christ died once and resurrected once." Muhammad Hersi. If the late Mugabe wasn't reckless with Zimbabwe, his nationals will not be languishing in South Africa under xenophobic attacks. Africans are really mean with the truth. He ruled Zimbabwe for almost 4 decades. He died in a Singaporean hospital. Kenneth Opalo. You have inherited a jewel in Africa. Don't tarnish it, Tanzanian President Julius Nyerere told him during the independence celebrations in Harare. Writing in a 2007 cable released by WikiLeaks, the US ambassador to Harare, Christopher Dell, reflected the views of many. To give the devil his due, he is a brilliant tactician. So absolutely, look, he fought for independence, he's still revered for that period, but he led Zimbabwe by the nose into a disaster. And I am not one person. I can recognize his freedom fighting credentials. They were absolutely cast iron, but too many leaders were unable to get beyond that very binary fight between themselves and the colonizers and actually develop their countries. In fact, he didn't develop it at all. So I think he has a very mixed heritage. 4 days into Parliament and he looks like a concerned relative has found him drinking heavily and shouting at pigeons in a bin. Jim felt Boris Johnson. I'd rather be dead in a ditch. This is what Boris Johnson said when a reporter asked him if he would ask for another delay on Brexit. Boris Johnson, as I said in August, is elected to quite properly take an impossible as nothing can do political posture, but the bottom line is, can he swing it? We still don't know. So that situation remains fluid. Sterling seems to think that he can't. I think I sort of propose, why doesn't he resign? Get the Queen to hand it to Corbyn. Corbyn won't be able to do anything, and then he goes and does his hard Brexit. Hezbollah is preparing to down an Israeli drone in the coming days. This is from Elijah Malray. Achieved the first part of its 2-part plan by hitting a military vehicle last Sunday. The attack caused the destruction of the Israeli vehicle and inflicted casualties among the 5 soldiers inside, notwithstanding the Israeli denial of casualties. The only real deterrent to Israel, including state-level deterrence, has been Hezbollah. Well-informed sources indicate that Israel deserted their military barracks and all positions along the Lebanese borders for fear of being bombed by Hezbollah's rockets. Trump can do little now to save his friend and advisor, Netanyahu. Look at this is interesting. Trend of all published UK public opinion polls over the last 9 years. Look at the Lib Dems. This was interesting. China's outbound trips in 2017 rose to 143 million from 5 million in 1995. Travel expenditures also topped the world at $257 billion in 2017, nearly 70 times what it was in 1995. Zero hedge, the advent of the internet created the conditions for cross-border, near instantaneous, peer-to-peer human communication for the first time in history. This is an important point. It disrupted the existing flow of information. We have the power to create our own narratives. And that took me to Virilio. The vectors of communication call into being a whole new geopolitics, not of territories and borders, but of communication and computational infrastructure. Previously, I've spoken about one of the defining bifurcations of the future will be the conflict between information masters and information victims. Information warfare will not be couched in the rationale of geopolitics, but will be spawned, like any Hollywood drama, out of raw emotions, hatred, jealousy, and greed. Emotions rather than strategy will set the terms of information warfare struggles. Previously, I'd said in an extraordinary boomerang, US's adversaries have turned social media on its head and used it as a Trojan horse via psychographic profiling and micro-targeting at a mass scale. I learnt a new word from Merriam-Webster. A mumpsimus is a stubborn person who insists on making error in spite of being shown that it is wrong. And on this point of voodoo economics, this response from Northman Trader sums it up, because they keep disconnecting asset prices ever further from the underlying size of the economy and zombie froth making an eventual downturn even worse. That's correct. And as I said in July, stoking up the fire with rate cuts is a very dangerous situation, because according to my calculations, the Fed will be needing to raise rates next year just as Trump is standing for re-election. And I don't think he's thought that through. Currency markets: euro, dollar 110.30, dollar index 98.35, Japanese yen 107, the figure. That's softened up of late as you had this flight out of the safe havens into risk assets. Swiss franc 0.9870, the pound 123.04, the Australian dollar's been rebounding as well, 0.6838, India rupee 71.6, South Korean won 11.94, Brazilian real 4.10, Egyptian pound 16.4835, and the South African rand 14.8235. Dollar index, my target is 100, then 110. We've had this interesting move where it's strengthened against safe haven currencies. Euro, dollar, I'm looking for 106 and then 1. Facebook has a secret crush feature which will let users pick up to 9 friends they'd like to date, and they'll get a notification if the feeling is mutual. It works only if you're on Facebook dating. And my problem with that is Facebook has always presented itself as an intermediary, but has been hawking all this information as if it were an intermediary. Commodity markets: gold 1506.75, that's a big move lower. Crude oil $55.75, that's had a strong rebound. I think that's going to run out of steam. USA shipped 60,732 tons of pork to China in July, smashing the all-time monthly record of 53,145. And that took me back to Santiago AU Fund. If you had said 2 years ago that the status of global geopolitics and financial markets depended on the world supply of pigs, you would have been laughed out of the room. But you would have been right. China's soybean futures hit limit down. And then, of course, this McAfee, who I've described previously as enigmatic and mercurial, fugitive and Bitcoin evangelist John McAfee, who always seems to pop up in my feed like an acid trip whenever Bitcoin is doing its parabola imitation. Parabola imitation it's a curve each of them feels unmistakably. It is the parabola. They must have guessed once or twice, guessed and refused to believe that everything always collectively had been moving toward that purified shape latent in the sky, that shape of no surprise, no second chance, no return. And then I saw this tweet by McAfee: "I've been kidnapped by men in an armoured limo. They speak Serbian with heavy Australian accents, and I saw little benefit and declined to follow suit. They got good drugs. Should I sound an alarm or invite my friends? There you go. Lebanese dollar bonds, the worst performers among emerging markets this year after crisis hit Argentina and Zambia, rallied this week, as did everything. Sub-Saharan Africa, Pope Francis attends a welcome ceremony flanked by Mozambique President Felipe Nyusi upon his arrival at the Maputo International Airport in Maputo. I like the photograph. Burundi on the edge of violence. Ahead of 2020 elections, the UN warns youth aligned to the ruling party known as Imbonerakure are the main perpetrators and operate with the consent of security and administration officials. The investigators were neither allowed into the country nor given any cooperation by authorities. Imbonerakure often act alone, sometimes in the presence of police, National Intelligence Service or local government officials. They enjoy great freedom conferred by the Burundian authorities, who have the means to control them and operate with almost total impunity. This is the red carpet. This is a tweet from the President of the Republic, S.E. Nkurunziza. I wrote about Burundi in May 2015 when I said, that Nkurunziza, Pentecostal, former aerobics instructor and rebel leader with his own presidential soccer team. And I was asking if there was a spillover risk, and so far there hasn't really been a spillover risk. But I was also quoting a chap called Barrow, who said there is an internationalization of African youth who are dreaming and thinking the same way. They cannot imprison hope. They will fail. Youth will continue to mobilize. I think that's correct as well. Ailing president leaves Gabon wondering who's running the show. Gabon is in troubled waters. You saw that footage of President Bongo attending, I think it was Independence Day celebrations last week. It was just extraordinary. And as I said to Al Jazeera in January, what we're watching across this continent, whether it's Gabon, Sudan or DR Congo, I should have added Zimbabwe, Chad and Cameroon and others, is a kind of tipping point moment. At the Am I Next protest in Cape Town, the police sprayed themselves with their own water cannon. Simon Allison, golden rule, don't piss into the wind. Dollar Rand's had a good recovery below 15s at 14.8234. Egyptian pound, one of the best performing currencies in emerging markets, below 1650. Mnangagwa quizzed by Bloomberg TV on how we will defend the value of the Zimbabwe dollar. Listen to his video, but the point is there is no trust, and I go back to Yuval, who said money is the most universal and most efficient system of mutual trust ever devised. And not just any system of mutual trust. And the problem is, if there is no trust, the money's not going to work, and that's the problem in Zimbabwe. There's no trust in ZANU-PF. Why not? So many instances. October 2018, the government's voodoo economics, where it spent $1.3 billion priming the Zimbabwe economy, money it did not have. Safaricom demands Kenyan rivals pay debt before merger. Safaricom is owed about $12.5 million. They're not happy about that. And Safaricom, of course, is now ex-dividend and trades on a P ratio of 16.86. So good to be back. Wishing you a great weekend.